What happens when a revival loses its leader and refuses to die? This is not a story about a preacher with a microphone or a movement with a stage. It is the story of Watchman Nee, a man the state tried to erase, a faith they tried to silence, and a revival they could not stop. Locked behind prison walls for nearly 20 years, cut off from his followers and the world, Nee never preached another sermon. Yet his influence multiplied. His silence spoke louder than freedom. His confinement exposed a kind of Christianity that survives without platforms, protection, or permission. Before we go any further, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who values deep stories of faith and endurance. It helps this message reach others who are searching for meaning beneath the surface. Now let's step into a story where prison failed, silence preached, and life proved stronger than power. Watchman Nee was not born into a revival. He was born into a China that was restless, fractured, and searching for meaning in the ashes of tradition and the pressure of modernity. This is important because it reminds us that movements do not emerge from comfort, they emerge from tension. Long before prison walls enclosed his body, social forces, cultural collisions, and spiritual hunger had already shaped his calling. To understand the revival that prison could not stop, we must first understand the man before the chains, the fire before the furnace, and the quiet awakening that would eventually shake nations. Watchman Nee was born in Tusheng in 1903, during the final years of the Qing dynasty. China at the time was collapsing under the weight of internal decay and foreign intrusion. Old certainties were failing. New ideologies rushed in to fill the vacuum. Confucian stability was eroding, Western influence was expanding, and Christianity, often associated with colonial powers, was viewed with suspicion. Yet paradoxically, this same turbulence created spiritual openness. People were asking deeper questions. What is truth? What gives life meaning? What remains when empires fall? Nee grew up in a relatively educated household. His mother was a committed Christian and played a crucial role in shaping his early exposure to faith. Yet his early Christianity was nominal, inherited rather than chosen. He was intelligent, articulate, and ambitious. He excelled academically and showed promise as a public speaker. At this stage, nothing about his life suggested a future marked by suffering and confinement. If anything, his gifts pointed toward influence, recognition, and upward mobility within society. The turning point came during his teenage years, when Nee experienced a profound personal conversion. This was not a quiet moral adjustment, it was a rupture. He later described it as a moment when God's light exposed the distance between religious knowledge and spiritual reality. That encounter dismantled his self-confidence and redirected his ambitions. Christianity was no longer a cultural identity or intellectual framework. It became an all-consuming allegiance. From that moment, his life moved in a different direction, one that prioritized obedience over safety and calling over comfort. What distinguished Watchman Nee early on was not charisma alone, but clarity. He believed that Christianity was not merely about moral improvement or social reform, but about spiritual life. He emphasized regeneration, union with Christ, and the inner work of the Holy Spirit. At a time when much of Chinese Christianity mirrored Western institutional models, Nee focused on spiritual vitality rather than organization of strength. He asked uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to be the church? Who has authority in spiritual matters? How should believers live together? These questions led him to challenge denominationalism and hierarchy. Nee believed that the church should be locally expressed, spiritually led, and free from rigid structures that replace dependence on God. This vision resonated deeply with young believers who were weary of imported religious systems. Small gatherings began to form. Teaching spread rapidly. What started as quiet Bible studies soon became a growing movement. Revival, in its earliest form, was already taking shape. But this revival was not emotionalism. It was deeply theological and intensely practical. Nee taught believers to examine the self-life, to surrender personal ambition, and to live from the indwelling life of Christ. His messages were demanding. They stripped away superficial faith and called for total consecration. People were drawn not because the path was easy, but because it was real. Lives changed, relationships were healed, communities were transformed. As Nee's influence expanded, so did resistance. Traditional church leaders viewed his teachings as disruptive. Western missionaries were uneasy with his independence. Government authorities were suspicious of any movement that operated outside state control. Yet none of this slowed the spread. By the 1930s and 1940s, Nee's writings and teachings had reached far beyond China. His books circulated internationally, carrying a distinctly Chinese articulation of Christian spirituality to the global church. Still, it is crucial to note that Nee did not seek persecution. He was not reckless. He believed in order, discipline, and responsibility. But he also believed that obedience to God must come before obedience to systems. This conviction would later cost him everything. The seeds of imprisonment were already present in his theology. A faith centered on inward allegiance rather than outward compliance cannot easily coexist with authoritarian control. As China moved toward communist rule, the space for independent religious expression rose dramatically. Many Christian leaders fled the country. Others compromised. Nee remained. He believed his calling was tied to the believers in China, regardless of cost. This decision marked the beginning of the final chapter of his freedom, though not the end of his influence. This is where the story sharpens, because what follows is not merely a tale of suffering, but a revelation of power. Prison would attempt to silence Watchman Nee, but it would fail. The revival that began in quiet rooms and humble gatherings had already taken root in something far stronger than institutions or leaders. It was rooted in life, and life, once released, cannot be imprisoned. In the next section, we will step into the rising tension between faith and state, and watch as devotion is tested under pressure, setting the stage for a confinement that would echo far beyond its walls. This early phase of Nee's life matters, because it shows us that endurance is not improvised in crisis, it is cultivated over time. The discipline, prayer, and theological depth he developed in freedom became the foundation that sustained him in captivity. His revival was never built on crowds alone, but on transformed individuals who carried the message wherever they went. Even before the prison gates closed, the movement had learned how to survive without a central figure. This distinction will become vital, because movements dependent on personality collapse under pressure. But movements rooted in shared spiritual life multiply when leadership is removed and faith is forced underground. This truth frames everything that follows. By the late 1940s, the spiritual movement associated with Watchman Nee had matured into something both resilient and dangerous. Resilient in spirit, dangerous in the eyes of power. China was no longer merely restless, it was transforming. The Communist Party's victory in 1949 marked a new ideological order, one that demanded total allegiance. Everything education, labor, family, thought, and belief was to be aligned with the state. Any authority that did not originate from the party was automatically suspect. Religion, especially one that could not be easily controlled, was not simply outdated, it was subversive. At first, the new government did not move immediately to imprison religious leaders. Instead, it employed a subtler approach. Churches were encouraged to register. Leaders were invited to cooperate. The message was simple: faith could exist, but only under supervision. The state would determine acceptable doctrine, approved leadership, and public expression. Many Christians, exhausted by decades of war and instability, hoped compromise might preserve space for worship. Watchman Nee, however, recognized a deeper cost. Registration was not merely administrative. It demanded submission of spiritual authority to political ideology. Nee refused to place the church under state control. This refusal was not loud or dramatic. There were no public protests or fiery speeches. Instead, it was quiet, steady, and unyielding. He continued teaching believers to follow Christ as Lord, not as a cultural symbol or social accessory. In a system that demanded ultimate loyalty, such teaching was intolerable. The church, as Nee understood it, belonged to God alone. That conviction placed him on a collision course with the state. Pressure mounted gradually. Meetings were monitored, believers were questioned. Informants infiltrated gatherings, accusations circulated economic crimes, counter-revolutionary activity, moral corruption. These charges were not unique to Nee. They were common tools used to dismantle independent movements. Truth was less important than control. To the authorities, the content of Nee's theology and less than its effect. People listened to him than they listened to the party. In 1952, the inevitable happened. Watchman Nee was arrested. The charges were sweeping and deliberately vague. He was accused of being an imperialist collaborator, a leader of a reactionary sect, and an enemy of the people. None of these claims were substantiated by evidence, but evidence was never the point. His arrest was a warning to believers, to leaders, to anyone who imagined a life of faith outside state permission. For many movements, this moment would have marked the end. Leadership removed, communication severed, fear unleashed. Yet something unexpected occurred. The movement did not collapse. It did not fragment into chaos. It did not dissolve into silence. Instead, it adapted. Believers continued meeting in homes. Teachings were shared orally. Scriptures were memorized. Faith went underground, not as a retreat, but as a transformation. This resilience did not happen by accident. Nee had prepared them for this long before prison walls surrounded him. He taught that the church is not a building, a hierarchy, or a public institution. It is the body of Christ, alive wherever believers gather. When structures were stripped away, what remained was life. And life, once internalized, is remarkably difficult to eradicate. Inside prison, Watchman Nee entered a different kind of ministry, one marked by silence, isolation, and endurance. He was denied books, writing materials, and regular contact with the outside world. Interrogations were frequent, confessions were demanded. Renunciation was offered as a path to freedom. All he needed to do was acknowledge the supremacy of the state over the church, admit ideological error, and publicly submit. He refused. This refusal was costly. Years passed, decades followed, his health deteriorated. Opportunities for release came and went, each tied to compliance, yet he remained steadfast. Not because he believed suffering was virtuous in itself, but because he believed truth could not be negotiated. To surrender inward allegiance would have been to betray the very message he preached, that Christ alone indwells and governs the believer. What is striking is how little we hear from Nee during these years. There are no prison memoirs, no letters smuggled out to inspire supporters, no dramatic declarations. His silence has often been misunderstood as passivity. In reality, it was consistency. He lived the theology he taught. The self-life must be surrendered. Obedience must be inward. Faithfulness is measured not by visibility, but by endurance. Outside prison, the movement continued to spread not through official channels, but through ordinary believers. Farmers, factory workers, students, and families carried the teachings forward. The absence of a central leader forced decentralization. Responsibility shifted from pulpit to people. This, ironically, made the movement stronger. There was no headquarters to shut down, no single voice to silence. Revival became cellular, embedded in daily life. The state attempted to replace underground Christianity with state-sanctioned versions of faith, stripped of spiritual authority and theological depth. Yet many believers recognized the difference. One was permitted religion, the other was living faith. The underground church chose the latter, even at great risk. Watchman Nee's imprisonment had become a dividing line not between belief and unbelief, but between convenience and conviction. This period reveals a crucial truth: persecution does not automatically destroy movements. It exposes them. What is superficial withers. What is rooted survives. Nee's theology, once considered radical, proved prophetic. By removing reliance on structures and personalities, he had unintentionally future-proofed the church against repression. As years turned into decades, the world outside largely forgot him. New leaders emerged elsewhere. Global Christianity moved on. But inside China, his influence quietly multiplied. The revival had changed form, but not direction. It was no longer visible, but it was deeply alive. And this brings us to the heart of the story. Because the greatest test of Watchman Nee's legacy was not whether he would be released, but whether his faith would outlive confinement. In the next section, we will step fully inside the prison years, not merely to observe suffering, but to understand how unseen faith reshaped the meaning of revival itself, proving that walls can restrain bodies, but never life. When Watchman Nee disappeared behind prison walls, something unusual happened to his message. It stopped being preached and started being proven. No sermons, no books, no conferences. Just a life reduced to a cell. And yet, this was the season when his theology reached its sharpest clarity. Because prison stripped everything away except what was real. And what remained was not charisma, not structure, not influence, but life. To understand this phase, we must resist the temptation to romanticize suffering. Prison was not poetic. It was brutal, monotonous, and humiliating. Nee endured years of isolation, forced labor, political indoctrination, and relentless pressure to confess ideological crimes he did not commit. He was cut off from his followers and from the global church. For a man whose life revolved around teaching and writing, enforced silence was a severe form of punishment. Yet that silence became the truest commentary on his message. 4 years, Watchman Nee had taught about the self-life, the ego-driven striving that disguises itself as spirituality. He spoke of surrender, brokenness, and living by another life within. Many admired the teaching, some practiced it. Prison, however, turned theory into reality. Every outward expression of usefulness was removed. There was no visible ministry left to protect his sense of purpose. If his identity had been tied to productivity or recognition, it would have collapsed. But it did not. This is where his theology proved costly and credible. He did not redefine faith to escape suffering. He did not reinterpret obedience to justify compromise. Instead, he embraced obscurity as obedience. In a system designed to break the inner man, he refused to surrender inward allegiance. He submitted externally where required, but inwardly remained free. This distinction mattered. It preserved the boundary between survival and surrender. One of the most remarkable aspects of Nee's prison years is how little we know about them. There are no detailed records of spiritual exploits, no dramatic conversion stories of fellow prisoners attributed to him. This absence is itself significant. His witness was not performative, it was consistent. Faithfulness, in this context, meant entrance without applause. The Chinese authorities understood something many modern observers miss: silence can be more powerful than speech. They attempted to extract a public confession from Nee not because they needed his repentance, but because they needed his endorsement. A single statement of compliance from him would have reverberated through the underground church. It would have validated the state's claim to ultimate authority. That is why his refusal mattered so deeply. Each year he remained imprisoned without renunciation was a quiet sermon preached to thousands he would never see again. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the underground church continued to evolve. With leaders imprisoned or executed, believers were forced to take responsibility for their own spiritual formation. Scripture was memorized because books were dangerous. Teaching became relational rather than institutional. Faith was practiced in whispers, kitchens, fields, and factory floors. The church did not shrink, it multiplied. Ironically, the absence of Watchman Nee accelerated the decentralization he had always advocated. There was no central figure left to idolize. Authority was diffused. Leadership became functional rather than hierarchical. Spiritual maturity was measured not by position, but by perseverance. The revival that prison could not stop had now fully detached from its originator. This reveals a paradox at the heart of Nee's legacy. His greatest contribution to the church may not have been what he taught while free, but what he demonstrated while confined. He showed that faith does not require favorable conditions to remain faithful. He embodied a Christianity that could survive being erased from public life. Inside prison, time lost its usual meaning. Days blurred, years passed, health declined. Hope, in its ordinary sense, became dangerous. Anticipation of release could become a tool of manipulation. Instead, Nee practiced a deeper form of hope, one that was not anchored to outcomes. Obedience, not deliverance, became the measure of success. This kind of faith is unsettling. It does not promise visible victory. It does not guarantee relief. It does not lend itself to inspirational slogans. Yet it is precisely this faith that authoritarian systems cannot tolerate, because it cannot be coerced. It cannot be negotiated. It cannot be controlled. Prison exposed the limits of power. The state could confine his body, but it could not reprogram his allegiance. It could isolate him, but it could not erase the life he carried. And because that life had already been reproduced in others, his confinement became strategically irrelevant. By the time the authorities realized this, it was too late. The underground church had become a movement without a center, a faith without a headquarters. Watchman Nee was no longer a leader in the conventional sense. He was a symbol, but not the kind the state could manipulate. His silence spoke louder than propaganda. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this chapter of the story, especially for modern audiences. We are accustomed to visible impact. We measure effectiveness by reach, output, and recognition. Nee's prison years defy those metrics. Nothing measurable happened, and yet everything happened. His life answered a question his teaching had raised. Is Christ sufficient when all else is taken away? The answer was not delivered in words, but in decades of endurance. As the years wore on, Watchman Nee became physically weaker, but spiritually immovable. He would die in prison in 1972, having spent nearly 20 years confined. By then, his voice had long been silenced, but his influence had outgrown him. The revival was no longer something he led. It was something he had released. And this prepares us for the next movement of the story. Because death did not conclude his legacy, in many ways, it activated it. In the next section, we will trace what happened after silence, how the global church rediscovered his writings, how the underground movement emerged into visibility, and how a man forgotten by the world became one of the most influential Christian voices of the 20th century, long after prison failed to stop the life he carried. When Watchman Nee died in prison in 1972, the world barely noticed. There were no headlines, no public funeral, no official acknowledgement of his life or legacy. To the Chinese state, he had been successfully erased to a forgotten prisoner, buried without ceremony, silenced without trace. But history has a strange way of exposing premature conclusions, because while his body was confined and ultimately destroyed, his influence was quietly crossing borders, languages, and generations. At the time of his death, most Christians outside China assumed his movement had been crushed. The Cultural Revolution had devastated religious life. Churches were closed, Bibles were destroyed. Believers were scattered. From the outside, it appeared that Christianity in China had been driven to extinction. In reality, it had been driven underground and underground. It had grown roots rather than branches. What followed in the decades after Nee's death was not a resurrection of his leadership, but a revelation of his foresight. The decentralized, life-centered vision he had taught was uniquely suited to survive persecution. When China began to reopen in the late 1970s and 1980s, observers were stunned to discover millions of believers, many with no formal clergy, no buildings, and no public history, yet possessing deep theological resilience and communal discipline. This was not accidental. It was the fruit of a theology that had already prepared believers to live without protection. Simultaneously, outside China, something else was happening. Watchman Nee's writings, smuggled out, translated, copied, and circulated, began to gain renewed attention. Western Christians encountering his work for the first time were struck by its depth. Here was a voice from outside the familiar theological centers of Europe and North America, speaking with clarity about spiritual life, surrender, and the church as a living organism rather than an institution. Books written decades earlier suddenly felt prophetic. Nee's emphasis on inward transformation, identification with Christ, and the danger of religious performance resonated with believers disillusioned by superficial spirituality. His teachings were not trendy, they were demanding. They required patience, self-examination, and submission to a life beyond the ego. In an era increasingly shaped by consumer Christianity, his work felt almost confrontational. And yet, it spread. What made his influence particularly striking was that it did not produce clones. Nee did not found a global denomination. He did not establish a branded movement bearing his name. His impact was quieter and more unsettling. He reshaped how people thought about authority, community, and obedience. He challenged assumptions about leadership and success. He forced readers to ask whether their faith depended on favorable conditions or internal life. This global rediscovery also reframed the meaning of revival. Revival, in Nee's story, was not a season of mass gatherings or dramatic manifestations. It was entrance. It was continuity. It was faith transmitted through ordinary believers under extraordinary pressure. This redefinition challenged Western narratives that equated revival with visibility and momentum. In China, as restrictions eased slightly, underground networks surfaced cautiously. Many believers traced their spiritual lineage, sometimes unknowingly, back to the teachings Nee had planted decades earlier. His influence had become diffuse, embedded rather than centralized. This made it difficult to quantify, but impossible to deny. The movement had survived precisely because it had not relied on him or his imprisonment. This raises a profound question. What kind of legacy survives intentional erasure? The answer, in Nee's case, is a legacy built on reproduction rather than preservation. He did not attempt to safeguard his reputation or secure institutional continuity. Instead, he invested in life, trusting that what was genuine would endure without his presence. Prison tested that trust, and history vindicated it. There is also a sobering irony here. The state succeeded in silencing the man, but failed to silence the message. In fact, by removing him from public life, it accelerated the spread of his influence. His suffering authenticated his theology in a way success never could have. Readers encountering his work decades later did so knowing it had been lived under extreme cost. That knowledge changes how words are received. This section of the story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power. Authoritarian systems often assume that control of bodies ensures control of ideas. Nee's life exposed the flaw in that logic. Ideas rooted in lived reality migrate, they adapt, they outlast regimes. The more pressure applied, the deeper they embed themselves in communities. Globally, Watchman Nee began to be recognized not merely as a Chinese Christian leader, but as a theologian whose insights transcended culture. His work contributed to a growing awareness that Christianity was no longer centered in the West. Voices from Asia, Africa, and Latin America carried perspectives forged under suffering rather than security. Nee became one of the earliest and clearest examples of this shift. Yet even as his influence expanded, it retained a certain anonymity. Many believers absorbed his ideas without knowing his story. This, too, reflects the nature of his legacy. He had always resisted personality-centered faith. Now, even posthumously, his work continued to function independently of personal recognition. What emerged after silence was not vindication in the traditional sense. There was no public apology from the state, no restoration of honor, no formal acknowledgement of injustice. Instead, there was something far more enduring: fruit. And this prepares us for the final movement of the story, because legacy invites evaluation. What does Watchman Nee ultimately teach us, not just about persecution, but about faith itself? In the final section, we will step back and ask what his life reveals about revival, authority, and the kind of Christianity that can survive the loss of everything except Christ. When we step back and look at the full arc of Watchman Nee's life, it becomes clear that this story is not primarily about persecution, nor even about China. It is about the kind of faith that survives when every external support is removed. It is about revival redefined not as noise, expansion, or visibility, but as life that continues when conditions are hostile and recognition is impossible. This is the final paradox of Nee's legacy. The revival that could not be stopped was not sustained by his presence, his voice, or even his writings. It was sustained by the kind of Christianity he embodied, a faith rooted so deeply in inward life that outward pressure could not extinguish it. Modern Christianity often struggles with this idea. We are accustomed to associating revival with momentum, growing numbers, packed gatherings, charismatic leadership, and measurable success. Nee's story dismantles that framework. His revival survived prison precisely because it did not depend on momentum. It depended on reproduction. What he imparted was not a system that required maintenance, but a life that could be carried. This distinction matters deeply. Systems collapse when leadership is removed. Life multiplies. Watchman Nee never lived to see the explosion of Christianity in China that followed the Cultural Revolution. He never witnessed the global impact of his writings. He never received affirmation, restoration, or public vindication. From a human perspective, his life ended in apparent failure, confined, silenced, and forgotten. Yet history tells a different story. The very conditions meant to erase him became the conditions that prove the truth of what he taught. His life answers a question many believers avoid. What remains when obedience costs everything? What remains, in Nee's case, was Christ as sufficient, not metaphorically, but practically. His theology of union with Christ was not an abstract doctrine. It was a survival strategy. When stripped of agency, recognition, and freedom, he lived from an inward source that could not be confiscated. That kind of faith exposes the limits of coercion. This is why authoritarian systems fear inward allegiance. You can regulate behavior, but you cannot legislate devotion. You can imprison bodies, but you cannot incarcerate life. Nee understood this intuitively, and the state eventually discovered it the hard way. By the time he died, the movement he helped shape no longer needed him to function. That was not a failure of leadership, it was its fulfillment. There is also a warning embedded in his legacy, especially for religious leaders. Nee resisted the temptation to build around himself. He refused to centralize authority in ways that would make the movement vulnerable. His imprisonment revealed how rare that discipline is. Many movements collapse when leaders are removed because they were never taught how to live without them. Nee's movement survived because dependence had already been redirected from man to life. This has implications far beyond persecution contexts. Even in societies where faith is free, the danger of shallow dependence remains. When Christianity is built on personality, platform, or performance, it becomes fragile. When pressure comes, whether through cultural hostility, scandal, or disillusionment, it collapses. Nee's life invites us to ask whether our faith is resilient enough to survive silence Another enduring lesson lies in his refusal to equate suffering with success. He did not seek martyrdom. He did not romanticize pain. He simply refused to compromise inward allegiance for outward relief. This balance is crucial. Faithfulness is not measured by how much we suffer, but by whether we remain true when suffering is unavoidable. His story also reframes what it means to be influential. Influence, in Nee's case, was not immediate, it was delayed. It unfolded across decades, geographies, and cultures he would never see. This kind of influence cannot be tracked in real time. It requires patience and humility. It also requires releasing control over outcomes, trusting that what is planted in life will grow beyond one's reach. Today, millions of Christians, both in China and globally, stand downstream from Watchman Nee's faith, often without knowing his name. That anonymity would likely have pleased him. His goal was never to be remembered, but to be faithful. In that sense, his legacy is not primarily historical, it is existential. It confronts every generation with the same question: is Christ enough when he is all you have? The revival that prison could not stop was not loud. It was not branded. It did not announce itself. It endured. It adapted. It multiplied quietly, carried by ordinary believers whose faith had been stripped down to essentials. That kind of revival is unsettling because it cannot be controlled or predicted. It does not need permission. It does not wait for ideal conditions. And perhaps that is the final lesson. True revival is not something we manufacture or manage. It is something we release by living faithfully, even when no one is watching. Watchman Nee's life reminds us that the most dangerous faith is not the faith that shouts, but the faith that survives. Prison closed around him, but it could not close around what he carried. And that is why, long after the cell door shut, the revival continued unseen, unstoppable, and alive. In the end, Watchman Nee did not defeat prison by escaping it, he defeated it by outlasting it. The walls that confined his body could not confine the life he carried. His voice was silenced, yet his faith multiplied. His ministry was erased from public view, yet it reshaped how millions understood obedience, endurance, and true revival. This story leaves us with a sobering truth: the strongest faith is not the one most protected, but the one most rooted. When everything else is stripped away, platforms, freedom, recognition, what remains reveals what was real all along. Watchman Nee's life reminds us that revival is not sustained by visibility, but by faithfulness, not by power, but by life. If this story challenged or inspired you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love deep, meaningful stories. And most importantly, drop a comment below what part of this story stayed with you the most.